This incident happened to me on St. Patrick's Day of 2020. To give a bit of context for later on in the story, I'm relatively short, only 5'2", not that strong, and of Mexican descent. Back in my freshman year of high school, I met a guy who, we'll call him Brick, was really sweet and always had a gentle heart for me and my group of friends. He was tall, about 6'2", was fair-skinned, and had thick curly blonde hair. The dude was the best person I could have had as a friend. Our group of friends all knew he had an almost obsessive crush on me, given the fact that he wouldn't let me out of his sight and would lavish me in gifts every chance he got. He only stopped when I started dating my current boyfriend in the beginning of 10th grade, Sonny. Brick backed off, but he still would flirt with me and give me extremely long and uncomfortable hugs, but I was blind to all of this. That and he backed off because my boyfriend is on the chubby side and knew how to handle guns since he was a kid. Everything was fine until Brick opened up to me about his home life. Apparently his parents were verbally and mentally abusive to him. He wanted to sneak out of his house and find a place on his own when he turned 18. Of course, me and my friends were shocked and helped him out the best that we can to move out. We found him a place to stay and offered up money and food to help him, but he declined. As soon as his 18th birthday came, he said that he would leave that day, but later on we all found out that he never left. He told me it was because he'd only stayed for financial purposes and he would just take the abuse, I guess. This was the first sign of something changing him into another person unlike himself. He slowly started to become more angry, depressive, and reclusive to our friend group. Rightfully, we all wanted to check up on him, but the only person he wanted to talk to was me. He ranted to me about how much of a terrible world this was, how the abuse was affecting his brain, and how he was thinking of ending his own life. I not only sent him numerous phone numbers on abuse hotlines and adult protective services, but the next day I took him to a counselor at a high school to talk about the situation. After the meeting, Brick convinced me that he was going to change for the better, but now halfway into 2020, our senior year, he only got more aggressive and depressed. I even told him that he was a legal adult that can get away from all of his pain and was even offering him to move in with me and my family, but he also declined and wanted to stay with his abusive parents. Quarantine finally broke his mental state, and the night of St. Patrick's Day he snapped. He was messaging me about his life and how cruel it was and horrible, how he wanted to end his own life because he couldn't stand being away from me. Now personally, I've dealt with these kind of thoughts and actions in the past and have recovered from it, and he knew I turned a new leaf from it. But in a frenzy of text he typed, "Why don't we just end our lives together? We could go out and have the time of our lives and go into the woods and just end it all." It made me break down, and I called Sonny about what Brick was saying to me, and he was furious and hung up to now message him. Brick kept messaging me, "You're worthless, but I am too. It's not a big deal, no one loves us. We could die in each other's arms. Sonny doesn't love you, and he wants you dead too." Of course, I asked Sonny this, and he said Brick was just manipulating me into doing it with him. I finally messaged, "I won't do it. I went through these thoughts and it was torture. I'm not going to be dragged down with you." At the time, Sonny was messaging him in a furious message just saying, "What right do you have to say this to my girl?" Then Sonny sent me screenshots of what Brick really thought of doing to me, and seeing these words made me fear for my life. Brick's message simply said, "You know, I could just kill her, right? I know where she lives. She's so small and helpless. A small dark girl like her doesn't deserve to be in a white man's palace. All that hugging we did, I could just break her like a twig. I could take her out into the forest, chop her up, and nobody would miss her." After this, we both contacted the police and they went to his house. My boyfriend's last message to him was, "If you come anywhere near her, our families, or myself, I'll shoot you dead on the spot." Before this incident, I had never seen my boyfriend so furious and surprisingly scary like that, but it was for a good reason. We alerted our friend group not to message him, for he seriously needs help, and nobody had heard from him since April. In fact, his last message to us wasn't even a sorry. It was him explaining how he was happy to spend time with his family and how he looked forward to seeing me in college. We were both enrolling in the same community college. It makes me livid to know that he or his family didn't even say sorry, but I'm just so thankful that he's out of my life. To the viewers who are listening to this, please, whoever's being verbally, mentally, or physically abused, just get them help. Be aware of what happens behind closed doors. And Brick, if you ever see this, be glad I didn't use your real name. You become this sick monster that is a shell of my now closest ex-friend. I never want to see you again, and if you contact me, Sonny, or our family ever in person, expect danger to be brought to your face and a warning shot. Stay away. When I was 11, my family lived in Alaska, about 14 miles north of Anchorage. As soon as you leave the actual city of Anchorage, you're in the wilderness pretty quickly. This event happened to me in the summer of 1977. I remember because the original Star Wars had just come out a few weeks before, and I was obsessed with it at the time. In 1977, the town I lived in was actually just a series of roads and off-roads. Most of the people there commuted to Anchorage for work. That's what my parents did. They both work nights, meaning I spend most of my time alone at home. I don't have any siblings. Our house was about a half-mile in from the nearest paved road and surrounded by woods. I didn't have any real friends that lived close by. I knew a kid who lived at the end of my road. His was actually the next closest house and was still about 300 yards from mine. One afternoon that summer, I was watching TV when there was a knock at our side door. I looked outside and saw it was the kid from the end of the street with someone else. I opened the door and he told me this kid was his cousin whose family had flown up from wherever they were from to visit. I can't remember the kid's name. I do remember immediately being nervous around this guy. He had blonde hair down to his shoulders, wore a t-shirt under a thin leather vest. He also had one of those wallets on a chain. This kid's eyes were incredibly dark. I was 11 and hadn't ever seen evil before, but this kid set off something in my brain. The boy from down the street even seemed nervous around him. He said he had told his cousin about my BB gun and how cool it was. I had recently been given a BB gun as a gift. I told them to wait outside and I would get it. I just knew I didn't want that kid in my house. I got the BB gun and went outside and handed it to the weird kid. He rolled it over in his hands and looked it up and down without his expression ever changing. Without handing it back to me, he asked me, "How much do you want for it?" I can't remember my reaction after all these years, but I didn't really need money and the gun was a gift, so I told him it wasn't for sale, and I remember apologizing for some reason. Unfazed, the kid hands the gun back to me, then reaches behind his back and pulls out the biggest knife I'd ever seen. I remember thinking for a second that it was a sword. If you've ever seen the movie Crocodile Dundee where he tells some robbers, "That's not a knife. This is a knife," and pulls out a huge knife, well, that's the knife this kid had. The kid said, "Well, how about a trade then?" I shot the BB gun at cans. What was I gonna do with this thing? Hunt a grizzly bear? I declined the offer nervously, and the kid turned away and started walking in the direction of their house. I went back inside and watched some more TV. About an hour later, there's another knock on the door. I go to our side window where I can see the door. I peek out and sure enough, it's that kid again. This time he was alone. The second time he knocked, it was louder. He called my name. I stayed quiet. He left the door and started walking around our house. My mother had a sunroom where she grew plants. It had large windows all along the wall. I saw him go to those windows, press his face against the glass and cup his eyes, trying to see deep into the house. I stayed out of sight. Luckily, there were no lights on and I had turned the TV off when I heard the knock. When he couldn't see anything, he continued around the house. He took out that huge knife and began tapping the butt of the handle along the outer wall as he circled. Then he started saying, "I know you're in there." I almost soiled myself. Of course he knew I was in the house. I was 11, home alone. How could I have left the house? Hop in the car and take off? Both our cars were gone anyway. I continued keeping low and quiet, hoping he might think I went to a friend's house somewhere else. How long could this psycho just circle the house? He was maybe 14. He'd get bored pretty quickly. No such luck. This kept up for about an hour, the tapping and his voice telling me to come out and that he had another trade for my gun. Screw that. I had gone all in on the I'm not home tactic, so I stayed quiet and made my way to the kitchen where our one telephone was. This was 1977. No cell phones, and our phone was attached to the wall in the kitchen. Luckily, it had a super long headset cord. I got it, stayed low to the floor, and called my mother at work. She took me seriously, but there was no way she could get home. My dad was in the Air Force, and they sure wouldn't let him skip out early to handle his son's crisis. I'd have to ride it out. The sun had gone down, and by that I mean it was barely peeking above the horizon. In the summer, the sun never went completely down in our area. The kid kept pacing around for another 30 minutes or so and then was suddenly gone. Not being an idiot in a horror movie, I just stayed down and quiet. Eventually my parents got home. I was still awake. They brushed it off as if to say, "See? Nothing to worry about." I never hung out with the kid down the street again, and I pretty much stayed inside the remainder of that summer. There was something wrong with that kid. Maybe it was in my head, or maybe he would have done something absolutely brutal to me, just for that BB gun. Due to lockdown measures, our city has introduced a curfew. This implies you can only leave your house at night for essential trips such as going to the hospital, coming and going to work, and coming from and going on vacation also falls under this category. The last one was the reason I was outside after curfew. I had a vacation planned for months to Spain and had to take the 3 a.m. night bus to the airport. I do travel a lot. I travel with a friend, with my parents, or alone. This time I was traveling alone. The place where I had to take the bus was a 20-minute walk away from my apartment. The walk was very uneventful, and as expected, I didn't see anyone wandering the streets. I did expect to see some police patrolling the streets to catch and fine and send home people who were outside without any reason, but none of them were anywhere to be seen. After reaching the bus stop, I still had to wait another 15 minutes for the bus to arrive. I was listening to some music and just looking around to see how empty the streets of the normally very busy city were. Suddenly I saw two men walking in the distance. They flagged down a taxi which was driving by and had a brief conversation with the driver, only for them to curse at him, slam the door of the car, and walk away. I thought, please don't come this way. I'm not in the mood for that in the moment. And you guessed it, that's exactly what they did. I'm going to describe these men for you guys to better understand the rest of the story and my convenience telling it. One of the men was about 5'9" and stocky build. He was also wearing a facial mask. The other was a bit taller at about 6'2" and rather muscular. I was hoping for them to just pass by the bus stop and go wherever they needed to be, but unfortunately they came straight at me. The masked man broke the ice with, "Hey dude, do you have €1 for us? We need to get to..." He proceeded to name a city which was about an hour drive away from where we were. "We don't have enough money for a taxi." I told him I did in fact not have any change for him, which was true because due to the convenience and safety I only paid with cards, and he didn't seem to believe me. He continued the conversation with saying, "Come on, we only need like €10 for the taxi." I told him again I didn't have anything for him, and if I did have €1, I definitely wouldn't have €10 for them. This seemed to anger him and the muscular guy which was just standing to my side staring me down the whole time. Once again, I told them sorry and hoped that they would just leave. But suddenly the masked man signed the muscular dude and he proceeded to grab me by the collar, and then he spoke up. "Listen, we can use force if we need to. It doesn't have to go this way if you just give us everything you got." Then the masked man added, "Yeah, he can bash your skull through the glass of this bus stop if he needs to. Just empty your pockets, kid." At that moment, I realized that I was getting robbed. But I'm not someone to just give up my belongings to some thugs. I asked the guy holding me to please take his hands off me and again told him I had no cash on me. I saw them look me over and looking at my headphones which I was wearing. Very expensive ones, I might add. They did cost me about €500. They insisted on me giving them all the money and belongings, and we're not having any of my "I don't carry cash, please." The buff dude said, "Well, if you don't have any cash, why don't you just show us your wallet?" I knew if I would take it out, they would see my bank and credit card, which can do some contactless payments with, and I knew for sure that they would be satisfied doing exactly that. My suspicions were immediately confirmed when one of them asked by what bank I was with and what kind of cards I got. I just told them the name of my bank and kept silent. All this time they were still holding me, and I was frantically looking around, hoping someone or at least some form of law enforcement would show up. They did notice me looking around and started laughing in my face, and the masked man said, "You're looking for the cops, aren't you? Trust me, they won't show up here. We can do whatever we want." After that, they let go of me and said, "Well, forget about everything that just happened. We're just going to make a deal. I'm going to sell you something right here and now." Then the buff dude lifted up his shirt only for him to take out a tablet from his belt. They showed me the tablet like an employee of an electronics store would, and I politely declined their offer. And once again, I reminded them that I didn't have any cash to pay them with, even if I wanted to. Then they started to talk about my headphones and phone. They said, "So those headphones, are they good quality, right?" I lied to them and said, laughing, "No, these are bootleg ones. The real deal's too expensive for me." But they told me I couldn't fool them. They knew that I was a rich, spoiled brat which got everything I wanted from rich, filthy parents, and they told me to take them off and also hand over my phone and wallet with. I told them that I was not just handing over my stuff, and if they so badly wanted to rob me that they indeed had to use force on me. They once again grabbed me by the collar and started to shake me just like a bully would do in cartoons. I knew this was a losing situation for me. I myself am a 21-year-old skinny guy, and because I was going to the airport, I had no kind of weapon on me to protect myself. I normally carry a huge hunting knife on me when I go outside at night for exactly this reason. I had to pull my knife once before, but that's a story for another day. So unarmed and not in any shape to fight, how am I going to win against a tall buff dude and his stocky accomplice? Either they end up beating me up and taking everything they wanted, or a miracle had to happen. And lucky for me, the last one did happen. Suddenly the bus, which I was waiting for, started to approach. When the guys noticed it, they let go of me, and together said some expletives. Since we weren't the only ones on that street anymore, they got spooked of having at least one eyewitness in front of the bus driver. They told me, "You got lucky this time," and proceeded to give me a friendly pat on the back and started to walk off. When I got on the bus, I was shaking like a leaf, and the bus driver noticed and asked me, "So those two guys, they aren't your friends, right? They were bothering you, weren't they?" I told him that they were trying to rob me, but they had failed due to him showing up on time, and thanked him at least a dozen times for doing so. I didn't call the police after this to report this incident because, knowing how law enforcement works over here, they would just send over a unit to patrol the area where things went down for a couple of minutes, and that's that. Even if those guys were still hanging around and they did manage to catch them, they would have no evidence against them besides me telling them that they were about to rob me, and because of that, they would still get off scot-free. This situation could have been a lot worse if they were armed themselves or they had more time to start beating me up, but nonetheless, I was shaken up from it for a long while. So if the bus did in fact show up any later, I would have lost everything I had on me. I was so thankful that it did, and seeing how those guys were acting, I'm pretty sure that this wasn't their first rodeo, nor their last. Stay safe, everyone, and don't go outside at night if you don't have to. This probably started when I was about 6 to 8 years old. I come from a broken family. A mother that had to work so much she was barely home, and my brother had to take care of my sister and I. When we were younger, we were in and out of shelters because of our abusive father. He made our lives torture. My sister and I were left home alone with our father, who was abusive and neglectful towards us almost constantly. I was the main focus of his abuse. I was his first daughter, but he wanted a son, so he always treated me like a boy. My mother had to protect me the most from him because he was angry that he didn't get a son as his first child. For years, whenever he would take me to my grandmother, he had me stay in the same bed as him. He seemed to focus on me not just with anger. Eventually, the older I got, the more time I spent alone with him, the more that he would touch me. Eventually, this led to more explicit abuse. At the time, I didn't understand what it was, so I didn't know it was bad, and because I never really saw my mom, I didn't tell her what happened. Don't worry, he spent a long time in jail for this. The older I got, he started telling me never to tell anyone. I didn't want to lie to my mother because she had started asking questions about what we did when we were alone together. Once it was found out what happened, we went to court, and he was in jail for 4 years. Once he got out, we got a restraining order against him, but that didn't stop him. He started stalking my sister and I. I was in middle school when this began. He kept trying to dismiss me from school, talk to me when I would walk home. Eventually, my mom had to get someone to walk my sister and I home since we walked together, but that still didn't stop him. He got my cousin to try and talk to me to bring me to see him, but I never went with her for fear of seeing my father. Once my father got fed up enough with trying to have contact with us, he tried to kidnap me multiple times. Mainly, it was with friends that I didn't know who they were or what they did. I had to go to therapy for years. I couldn't leave the house without feeling like I was going to be kidnapped and taken away forever and never see my family again. While I was a freshman in high school, my mother had answered the front door as there was a knock. I listened in because I didn't want it to be my father, and he had harmed her, but it wasn't my father. It was one of his friends who made a death threat to my entire family if he wasn't allowed to see me. We had to go to court for it, but it took a year and a half to get approved for him to see me. Around that time, it was confirmed that he had passed away. I was never told how he died, but I was only told that he was dead. Even though he's been gone for almost 4 years, I still have to go to therapy. I can't sleep, I rarely eat, and I have horrible nightmares about my childhood, and I've been diagnosed with clinical depression. Nobody from his side of the family or friends have tried contacting my family, but luckily I don't have to deal with him or anyone ever again, and I'll be forever thankful that that part of my life is over. I'm a 29-year-old female, and this happened to me 11 years ago when I was 18 years old. I live in New Mexico and had just left for my first year of college. I had chosen to go to Highlands University, which is in Las Vegas, New Mexico. It all started when I met this guy in my art class. Back then I used to smoke, and this guy had asked me if I wanted to come to his dorm after class and smoke. I'll call him A. Stupidly, I said yes, so we get to A's dorm, start to talk, and are hanging out and smoking. There was 2 other guys in A's room. One of them I had somewhat known because he lived in my dorm building, and I had seen him around. I'll call him B. The other guy in the room I had never met or seen before. I'll call him F. So we're all just hanging out when A decides that we should all go on a drive to see the castle in the mountains. The mountains were only a 10-minute drive from the university. There's also a hot springs a lot of the college kids go to, and past there's also a castle which is actually an international boarding school now. So we all get in F's car and decide to go check it out. So we're driving, and a voice inside me tells not to go up to the mountain. I thought I was being paranoid and decide to ignore it. We're passing through the castle when A says that we should take a drive into the mountains. Again, I got that horrible feeling not to go up and to turn around, but like an idiot, I once again ignore it. I've never been in these mountains and had no idea where we were going. We start up the mountain, and the guys start to drink some Crown Royale. I've never really liked drinking, so I just have one shot. So we're driving pretty far into where we stopped seeing houses, and we're just surrounded by forests. It was late October, and as we started reaching higher elevation, it started to snow. We pulled over and danced around in the snow, just having a good time. During this time, F had come up to me and told me if anyone was bothering me, he would mess them up. I got a really weird feeling from him and told him I didn't know what he was talking about. I told him that everything was fine and we're all just having fun. We decided to get back in the car and continue the drive further into the mountains. Finally, we were no longer able to keep driving because there was a pole blocking the path. F gets out of the car and goes up to the pole. On the pole there was a metal sign. F proceeds to punch and pull the sign with such rage that I instantly got this horrible feeling about him. He gets back in the car and we start on our way back down. I had no idea F, who was the driver, had been drinking or how much. This guy was all over the road, and being that we were on a dirt road, it was lightly snowing, the road was pretty muddy, and we were drifting all over the place. I was so freaked out that when we made another stop, F had gotten out of the car, and I told A to go and get the keys from F and drive us the rest of the way down the mountains. I'm sitting in the car with B, watching as A goes to talk with F. I start to get out of the car and walk towards them when, out of nowhere, F pulls out a black baton, like the ones police use, and hits A hard across the face. A does nothing, just starts to cry. My stomach instantly drops and I realize what a horrible situation I'm in. There's no one around. We're in the middle of the woods and this guy just went from 0 to 60 and turned into a complete psycho. On top of that, A isn't defending himself and B was a tiny guy, even smaller than me, so I just knew that they weren't going to stand up to him. As this all goes through my head, I start to hyperventilate and panic. I didn't know what to do, so I just started saying, "No, no, no," as I walk away from the car. F comes charging at me and raises the baton at me to hit me. I put my hands up and try to calm him down and tell him, "Okay, I'll get back in the car, let's just get in and go." This seems to work, and we get back in and start driving. There's still nobody and nothing around, and F is just hauling it all over the road. I thought I really was about to die then and there. I had no idea what F was going to do to us. I've always had strong men in my life, and I couldn't believe A and B were acting like defenseless little girls. Like me. This whole time driving, F is screaming at the top of his lungs at us in the car and taking his rage out mostly on me. I'm sitting in the back with B, so F is turned around yelling at me, not even looking at the road. It's honestly a miracle we didn't crash. I'm trying to talk him down, but it's not working. This dude has literally turned into Jekyll and Hyde. I tried using my cell phone to call the cops, but we were so far in that I had no service. Great. So many thoughts were racing through my head. I started talking to God silently because I really thought that I was about to die. I started praying, asking God to help my mom find my body up here in the mountains and help her find F, the person who will be responsible for my death. I start to think the next time he stops the car, I'll just make a run for it, even if there's nothing around. It was snowing and cold, but I would rather freeze than stay in this car. I'll run into the woods and hide there till F gives up looking for me, then make my way down the road till I hopefully run into something or someone. My heart was pounding so hard the whole time. As we were driving, there was a man on the side of the road taking pictures of the forest. I pressed my face up against the window so that maybe he would see me and the terror on my face and know something was wrong and get help. We were driving so fast, and fortunately he never got the chance to even see me. All of a sudden, F slams on the brakes and starts to get out of the car saying he was going to beat up B, and came to the door where B was sitting beside me. I had no idea what he was about to do, and I was terrified. As I'm watching, I see far up the road there was a house and a car was pulling out and started driving the opposite way of us. Again, the voice inside me tells me to get out of the car and start running. I was so scared I grabbed my purse, opened the door, and made a run for it. Have you ever had a dream where you can barely run even though you really want to? Or a scary movie where the girl is barely running from the killer and you're yelling for her to run faster? Well, that was me. I don't know if it was because of all the adrenaline or I was scared what F would do to me if he caught me, but I wasn't really running, more of dragging my body and forcing myself to move. It was truly like a horror movie. I'm screaming and waving my hands trying to get the car's attention. The car doesn't seem to see me and keeps driving. I make it to the house where the car came from and burst onto the property. There was about 5 dogs guarding the house barking at me viciously, but I didn't care. I ran onto the porch and started banging on the door. Luckily, as I looked around, all the dogs were tied up. I keep banging, but no one was answering. There was nobody home. As I'm freaking out thinking what I should do next, F comes driving up in front of the house and stops the car. My heart sinks. I start pacing and panicking. A opens the door, still crying, and starts to get out of the car, telling me to get back in. In my head, I'm thinking, no way, you're insane. I'm not getting back in. You'll have to drag me from this porch. I yell at him no and start freaking out, knowing that they will have to force me to get back in, and who knows what F will do to me. As A has his leg out of the door, about to come get me, the car that had driven down the road had turned around and pulled up to the house. At the sight of the car, F takes off. A falls out of the car, crashes to the ground as is nearly ran over by the psycho. A flood of relief washes over me as the owner of the house gets out of his car and asks what's going on. A and I try our best to explain and ask the man if he would drive us back to campus. We get in his car, and as we're driving back, I just lose it. From all the adrenaline and trying to keep my composure the entire time of this ordeal, I just broke down. I just started to cry so hard I couldn't breathe and started hyperventilating really bad. We tried telling the man driving us what had happened, but having two hysterical teens trying to explain through tears didn't really help. All the man said was we smelled like alcohol and he needs gas money for taking us. To be honest, he was kind of a jerk, but I was just thankful to have a ride and be alive. On our way, B was waiting on the side of the road, so we stopped and picked him up too. He told us when he got the chance F wasn't looking, so he decided to jump out of the car when F had slowed the car down enough for him to jump out. Finally, shaken up and still crying, we had made it back to campus. I went to the police the next day, but they said they couldn't do anything. So, thanks for nothing. I never talked to A or B after that. I saw F once on campus after that, but just avoided him completely. It took me a few years to get over this incident, and in some ways I never have. If I would see someone that looked like F, the anxiety would overtake me, and my body would start shaking. Moral of the story, whenever the voice inside of you is trying to tell you there is danger and screaming not to do something, always listen to that voice. Don't ignore it like I did. And ladies, don't put yourself in a stupid situation. I'm the only girl in my family with two huge older brothers who would kill for me. To be alone with three guys, one who was a psycho and two others who wouldn't defend themselves or me, was absolutely terrifying. I never want to feel that helpless again. Don't be stupid like me. I'm now married to a really hardcore husband who would never let anything happen to me. He bought me a gun, which I take everywhere. I put myself in a really bad situation then that could have ended a lot worse, and I'm so thankful that it didn't. I believe I know what happens when you die. On March 16th, 2015, I was released from prison for the last time. It's what everybody called 12/12. And if you've been to prison or jail, you know what this means. But for everybody who had never been or know anyone that's been, it's when you finish everything. No more probation or parole. No more being on a run when you don't follow the rules or decide to get high or just stop reporting it to your parole officer. 12/12 means that you're a 100% free man. Free to do anything you want to do and go anywhere you want to go. You're literally reborn again. If you've ever gotten your freedom taken away, you'll understand my next statement. Finally getting your freedom back feels better than making love. No debate. But know that it feels incredibly good. Anyways, I was released from prison and I had to go back to my hometown, St. Louis, because that was the closest Greyhound station, and I was finally able to go back home to my family in Springfield, Missouri, and my first and only son, who was 3 at the time, my stepdaughter and baby mama, who I haven't seen for almost 3 years because I went back to prison in 2013, and after getting out, I was forced to go back to St. Louis Honor Center because she moved to Illinois and they don't home plan people to out-of-state residents. While in St. Louis Honor Center, I no longer had family or friend houses to go to on weekends because everybody either moved away or died since I've been gone. So I had nowhere to go but downtown St. Louis, where the Honor Center was located, and I quickly learned where everybody would be and started using what they were using, K2 or Spice. Now, all that said, let me get to the story. After getting released, I ended up back downtown because, like I said, that's where the Greyhound station was. And since I had close to 5 to 6 hours to waste before the bus leaves, I decided to go around the corner to the old stomping grounds to what's going on. But when I got there, nobody was out. It was like a ghost town. So I decided to head back to the Greyhound station, but as I turned around, I seen my dude D-Man rolling up. And when he sees me, his face lit up and he gave me a big bear hug, and then praised me on how good I look now that I'm not on all them drugs. After a brief conversation, he started telling me about how he's the man around there and he's got the best crack in K2 in town as we walked to the library where everybody be now. Not in the library, but around it while everybody sold whatever drugs they got. I let him know that I'm finally going back to Springfield and we might not ever see each other again, and he decided to roll a big joint of K2 to take away the pain and hurt of losing a good friend and for better days to come. I know. Crazy, right? And also noticed that I haven't smoked or gotten high for a really long time, so I still had virgin lungs and my tolerance was low. So we smoke, and while we're smoking, other people started coming up to buy crack in K2. The ones buying K2 fired up, and we started passing joints around like we're at Snoop Dogg's smokehouse, and all I can remember is me starting to throw up like crazy and thinking, God, I'm fitting to die, and then everything went black. And then like somebody pushed fast forward, I seen everything I'd ever done or thought in my life go by with incredible speed, and then I ended up in a parking lot trying to break into somebody's car, and then the person whose car was there with a gun, and then he shot me in the head. I seen the spark of the gun, felt the pain, and then everything went black. I came to the darkest place I'd ever seen. I mean, the darkest of dark. And I couldn't see anything, but I could hear myself think. I could talk, but only in my mind. Am I dead? What happened? Oh God, is this all I'm gonna see for the rest of my days? I can see my hands. Oh God, Lord, please don't let this be it. Is this hell? What happened? Okay, think. What's the last thing you remember? While trying to remember, I remembered my past life. Everything I'd done and said. Everything I thought. And every crime I committed. But for the life of me, I couldn't remember what got me here. Then it hit me. Prison. Getting released. D-Man. Okay, what else? I remember now. Throwing up bad, and think I'm gonna die. Springfield. Son. My son. Did I ever see my son again? Did I ever get back to Springfield? See my baby mama? Stepdaughter? Then it hit me. I got shot in the head. For trying to steal somebody's car. Why was I trying to steal somebody's car? Better yet, why was I still in St. Louis? Why didn't I get on that Greyhound bus? My son. Oh God, I'll never see my son again. The whole time I was thinking these things, I couldn't see nothing but blackness. But the thoughts of my son finally brought me back to reality, and I was standing on the curb still throwing up on myself. I just decided to walk down to the Greyhound, but D-Man put his hand on my shoulder and told me to sit down. Just then the ambulance pulled up. Somebody called, but I didn't want to go, but D-Man told me to go and get checked out, so I did. On the way to the hospital, I needed to throw up more, so they gave me a throw-up bag and I threw up the whole ride there. After getting to the hospital, I told the doctor the truth about smoking K2, and after giving me the you shouldn't be doing that speech, they ran the tests and let me go after everything checked out. Before leaving, I took my pants off and washed off the throw-up with paper towels and eventually made my way to the Greyhound station. And even though I still had a lot of hours to wait, I didn't go back around the corner and stayed put. Eventually the bus came and I gave my ticket and got on the bus. The whole ride there I had to keep running into the bathroom to throw up, but finally after 5 hours I made it. You would think after that incident that my K2 days would be over. Wrong. But something really scary finally happened that made me stop for good, and now you can't pay me to smoke that. Let me know if you want to hear what happened, and until then, have any of you ever seen your life flash before your eyes in darkness? Abuelita used to tell me stories about her early years at the rural south of Mexico. She used to live in a small town surrounded by fields that would extend to the bottom of the mountains around the valley. These fields were owned and operated by the wealthy folks of the town, and like her parents, the rest would just work on the fields to earn a living. Because her parents were really poor, when she turned 16, she had to join them to work as a picker at their assigned parcela. Now, Abuelita told me that she was a pretty young woman, and for that same reason, her father wouldn't allow the other men to engage her. Anytime one of them would try to get near her, her father would just walk toward her in his menacing face. One day, however, the son of the parcela owner had come to the fields to check on them, and he had stopped right at her to ask her name. Abuelita's father wouldn't dare say a thing. In fact, he seemed rather inclined to the idea of his daughter marrying that kid, but still, to appear unbiased, he approached them in his usual face and asked her to go back to work. The owner's son simply went to check on the rest. Abuelita said that for a month or so, they would secretly meet by the edge of the field only for a brief moment. She was madly in love with him, or so she thought, and as soon as they realized those few minutes weren't enough, they decided to meet later at night so their parents, especially her father, wouldn't catch them. Excited at the prospect, she gave no second thought to their plan, and when the night fell and her parents were asleep already, she snuck outside and walked the dark unpaved streets to meet her secret lover at the same spot by the edge of the parcela. Since electricity was reserved only to agriculture machinery, they relied only on the light of the moon to take a stroll around without tripping or encountering a wild animal. For hours, they talked about each other, about what a life at the city was like, and he would tell her all about it, about the cars, the buildings, and that if they were to marry, he would take her to live there one day. Abuelita said after a while, he stole a kiss from her, and even though she didn't approve, she liked it. Yet the love spell she was under began to erode when he kept insisting on kissing her more and more. She kept repeating that she was uncomfortable and tired. Now, in retrospect, I fully understand the situation that was unfolding. Abuelita was raised as a hardcore Catholic, and such event was simply not meant to happen in such a manner, at least in her own beliefs. Besides, her parents would be livid had they found out what had happened, even if they were rooting for such a relationship. So, she pushed him. He wouldn't stop insisting. Then, having no other option, she cried out loud in the hopes of some of the valedores, the nighttime guards of the field, would listen to her pleas. It seemed that there was no one around, and they were, by then, too far away from town to be heard by her parents or the people living by the outskirts. In desperation, Abuelita said she could only think of praying in her head. She prayed to the Guadalupana, to the saints, and to God. She prayed so much she even believed there would be a divine intervention, that the Virgin Mary would come herself to set her free from his arms. Yet there was no Virgin Mary, she would tell me. What happened next would haunt her forever. From within the fields, lights began to spring from the thin air. The scene appeared as if people with torches were approaching them, thousands of them. The owner's son turned around and stopped forcing onto her, afraid of what they were seeing. Soon the lights caught up to where they were lying. They saw them. Those weren't torchlights. There were thousands of men and women and kids, all burning in yellow flames. Their flesh was intact, however, but their faces were those of sorrow and misery and fear. There was no eye contact. They simply walked by. They were speaking gibberish while holding their hands as if reciting the Lord's Prayer. Kids and adults alike, Abuelita said. When one of them walked just a couple of feet away, they felt the temperature go down rather than up, as if the fires were ice cold. The owner's son was in shock. He couldn't move, say, or do anything. Abuelita, on the other hand, kept praying, now with her eyes closed. She said she knew exactly who these folks were. The souls of purgatory, she told me. They saved me from, they saved me from Mijo. Their fire was to purify themselves to be worthy of heaven, but it didn't matter, because that night they were there for me. So every other night I make my prayers about them so that they can find salvation one day. I owe them. After the fire folks had left, disappearing from the fields and meeting the mountains at the horizon, Abuelita didn't think twice before sprinting back to town, to the safety of her parents. She couldn't speak for hours, until she did, only to alert them about her lover. They found him the next day. His hair was gray, and his sight seemed lost. He was dead. Abuelita said he passed away from fear, but I believe he might have simply been in shock too long and died from exposure. Either way, he was no longer among the living. She pondered upon if he had made it into purgatory or gone straight into the other, worse option. And if the former, was he going to wander the fields in case some other victim cried for divine intervention? I know, not the most orthodox thing to wonder, but that's just how she was, and I can't blame her. So that's her story. I know it's a little bit short, but she had many others from that rural town. She said that there's something about living so far from the bigger cities that entice the paranormal to spawn. Anyways, I always wanted to share them so that they don't die in oblivion. Maybe I'll share the rest some other time. Lastly, Abuelita, thank you for an amazing childhood and for all the experiences you shared with me. Even if they kept me awake so many nights, they eventually contributed to my love for scary stories, and for that, I'm truly grateful. This is a true paranormal story of the home I lived in from 13 years old. The old homestead Glencoe was built in the 1860s by convicts transported to Tasmania for whatever crime they had been found guilty of back in England. It was a huge old place, big enough that we, a family of 8, only used one half of it. The other half was blocked off and used for storage and the like. No one had lived in the old homestead for a quarter of a century before we moved in. It wasn't in the best of condition as a result, but Dad, as a builder and a stonemason, he did what needed to be done. But we all knew we weren't alone in that old house. We had guests, or perhaps they considered us the guests since they were there long before we moved in. At first, we laughed about Glencoe being haunted, making light of it and treating it as a bit of a joke. Yet we all knew it was very real, even if we didn't want to take it seriously. Glencoe had 4 resident ghostly beings that we knew of. The first 3 was a man called George, a woman called Matilda, and a young girl about 7 years of age we'll call Amelia. I'll talk about the 4th shortly. We assumed George, Matilda, and Amelia were the family who built the house. The graves of the original owners were on the property not far from the home. We didn't experience so many things often seen in claimed ghost videos. There were no slamming doors, no flickering lights, no moving curtains or any of the other things so often shown in ghost videos today. Only occasionally did we hear knocking within the walls. Even then, it was only in one area of the house, an old sunroom. We did, however, hear strange noises like footsteps and often felt as if someone or something was watching. Things moved on their own or went missing only to turn up in the most unusual places. About 6 months after we moved in, George, Matilda, and Amelia decided to make themselves known. They weren't just ghostly faces peeking around corners either. They were full-bodied appearances standing in the hall or lounge or by the kitchen door. The child Amelia was often seen running around the house as if playing. All were always in 19th century clothing, and George, who we and visitors saw the most, always had his black top hat on. Yet the house never had a bad feeling about it. To the contrary, there was a friendly warmth within that house. Of course, that doesn't mean the ghosts didn't scare the bejesus out of us and visitors when they decided to appear. We grew used to living with them, however, and lived there for more than a decade. In all that time, George, Matilda, and Amelia never felt hostile. Rather, they seemed to be more curious than anything else and seemed happy to have us living there with them. It made it hard to have guests, though. More than one person entered that house only to run out and refuse to ever enter it again. Many a skeptic also left our house completely converted into a believer. The 4th entity was a different matter entirely. I say entity because I don't know what the 4th was. It was not the same as the other 3, and it was not friendly. While Matilda, George, and Amelia would appear where and whenever they pleased throughout the house, the 4th seemed to be confined to one particular room, a bedroom shared by my older sister and I. We called this entity thing. Whoever or what it was, I still don't know, but thing was utterly terrifying. And all the time we lived at Glencoe, no one ever saw thing, yet we knew it was there. Even during the day, with the sun streaming through the large window, chasing all the shadows out, that one room was a bad place. Whatever inhabited the room was something no one wanted anything to do with. The nights are worse. It seems strange to say a ghost or other entity breathes. After all, they're otherworldly beings and have no need to do so, yet it's the only way to describe what thing did. Lying in bed at night, my sister and I could hear thing's heavy breathing as it literally filled the room. It sounded as if though it had been running. Unseen eyes bored into us as we lay in bed, trying very hard to pretend it was nothing more than our imaginations. We could pretend all we liked, however. There was no doubt whatsoever thing existed in that particular room and had no intention of going anywhere. It also seems weird to say something we never saw was far scarier than the actual ghostly apparitions of George, Matilda, and Amelia, but it was. We could live with George, Matilda, and Amelia. They meant no harm, and had no problem with us living in the house with them. That didn't mean they liked everyone who came into the house, though. One time, George seemed to take exception to a group who came to visit. He appeared right in front of the man and his two friends, telling them to get out. The man actually walked through George, he was so close to them. The group let out terrified screams racing from the house and refusing to ever enter it again. Yet George and his family seemed to like us, and we never felt any hostility from them. The sounds of ghostly parties in the living room, the things going missing, the other weird sounds and strange occurrences in the house weren't bad. After living there for a while, we got used to it. But no one ever got used to thing. Who or whatever inhabited that bedroom was utterly terrifying and came from hell itself, and that we were sure. One didn't have to see or even hear it to know that. One could just feel it the moment one entered that room. What was it? Another ghost? Who, unlike George, Matilda, and Amelia, was angry for some reason? Perhaps his life was cut short somehow and he resented it. Perhaps he was an evil bugger even in life and remained that way in death. Or maybe thing was something else entirely. A demon, perhaps. One time my brother and his friend decided to use a Ouija board to find out. They claimed to have contacted a convict spirit who called himself Rabbit. What he'd done back in England to end up a convict transported to Tasmania was never discovered, but he was apparently hung on the property for murdering somebody. My brother and his friend were only young at the time they contacted Rabbit. It was never ascertained if their claims were true or if it was something they'd simply made up, although my brother to this day insists it really happened. Was Rabbit the thing living in that room, angry because he'd been executed? Perhaps it was the person he murdered who was angry because he'd been killed. Even if the claims of my brother and his friend are true and they really did contact a spirit named Rabbit, I personally don't think Rabbit, or his victim for that matter, was the entity we called Thing. Whatever inhabited the bedroom was pure evil, and unlike George, Matilda, and Amelia, we were in no doubt Thing would do us harm if it could. Some nights it felt as if Thing was leaning right over me as I lay in bed, too scared to move. My sister had the same experiences, and so did others who spent a night in that room. One evening I walked into the bedroom and stopped as the hairs on my neck stood straight up as something gave a gruff chuckle. It was pure evil and felt as if though someone or something was right behind me, but when I got enough courage to turn, there was nothing there. I knew it was Thing. I'd heard that awful chuckle before during that night. A part of me wanted Thing to appear so I could see what it was. The bigger part of me, though, didn't want to know, fearing what I might see. I was about 18 at the time. I'm in my 40s now, but to this day remember the feel of Thing in that chuckle. Some years later, we discovered an 8-year-old girl died in that room after falling into the fireplace and sustaining severe burns. Was it the little blonde-haired ghost child we called Amelia? We never found out, but assumed it was. Was Thing somehow connected to that death? Who knows? I only know Thing lived in that room and was pure evil. We left Glencoe after Dad's sudden death in December of 1994. Without his skills as a builder and stonemason to see to the upkeep of the house, it was impossible to keep it in livable condition. It was just too big and too old. We said goodbye to George, Matilda, and Amelia in mid-1995. No one has lived in the house since, although I hear the current owners of the property want to renovate the house and turn it into a hotel and conference center. I've no doubt George, Matilda, and Amelia still live there, and I'm sure Thing is still there in that bedroom as well. If the old place is turned into a hotel and conference center, I wonder what the ghosts of Glencoe will think about it. So a word of warning. If it does become a hotel and you should decide to stay there, say hello to George, Matilda, and Amelia. If they like you, you'll feel welcome there. If they don't, well, all I can say is you'll know all about it, and it's unlikely you'll ever be game enough to stay there long. As for Thing, if you stay in the first bedroom on the left next to what was originally an old sunroom, you'll quickly know what I'm talking about when you realize you're sharing a room with a terrifying entity. Are you game enough to stay in a room inhabited by something from hell itself? I would go back. Despite Thing, I love that old place and I hope one day to return. If I do, I hope I see the ghosts of Glencoe one last time. A part of me still wants to know what Thing is and why it's there. I was in my mid-20s when we left the house, and still after all these years I wonder about Thing. It was a terrifying yet strangely fascinating entity, but I'm not sure I'd have the courage to face Thing. It's easy to say I would while not at the house, but to go back into that room would be different entirely. I still remember the feeling of evil and terror in that room. It's not something one forgets, believe me. I firmly believe even now, if Thing had the power to kill someone, it would. This story came up when I was talking to my grandma about cattle mutilations. I was talking about a deer skin being found in the woods by some guy while he was camping, and my grandmother suddenly gasped. She then went on to tell me that when she was 26, she was home alone sleeping one day while my grandpa was at work and my mom was at school. She said that at some point through her sleep, she was startled awake by a semi-loud boom coming from the highway. She got dressed and went out to investigate and almost immediately noticed a giant red blob right on the yellow line of the road. She said that as she neared closer to it, she realized it was a horse, a skinless horse. She described it as having absolutely no skin at all and said that she could see every nerve, every vein, and all of the muscle on it, dead, laying in the road. She said 2 truck drivers pulled over to stare at the horse as well, and that they were so weirded out by it that they just stared at it for a while. My grandmother said she called the police out there and it was cleaned up. My mom recounted the story as well, saying that my grandmother seemed a bit on edge the whole day, and my mom remembered being a bit creeped out too. I'm not sure of how real it is, but I hope I never have to experience something like this. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, ghosts are just farts that never got smelt.